What is up, everyone? My name is Michael Pohl with BayAreaAquatics.com, and today we're going to be talking about an easy, low-maintenance live food that you can keep in your house to help you breed fish. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about microworms. So I got a microworm culture from Larry and Mary. They're the people whose fish room house thing breeding facility I toured like a month or two ago that a lot of you guys watched. One of the things that they gave me when I left was a microworm culture along with the oats and the yeast and all that to get started. Now I've got a bunch of cultures because I tested a whole bunch of stuff out, but let's go ahead and get into why you would want one and how you would set one up. Microworms are a super good live food for breeding fish because they're tiny. So little things like guppy fry and that can actually eat them. Live food also promotes good breeding health and things like that as well. Another thing that I like about microworms is they're fairly low maintenance. They only require about once a month, like maintaining. And it's pretty cheap, and it pretty much kind of just keeps going and going and going until you crash it. Alright, so let's go over the list of things that you're going to need to start a microworm culture. First off, you're going to need a starter culture. This runs $5 to $15 online, depending on where you buy it from. I got mine, like I said, from a local hobbyist in a fish club. I've seen them come up in the fish club auctions and things like that. If you reach out to people that you know are breeding fish, they probably have a culture or something similar to it. If not, like I said, on eBay, $5, $10, $15. And this is something that's going to last you for years. So in reality, it's really not that big of a cost up front. Next, you're going to want some sort of container. I like Tupperware containers with flat edges. You don't want something textured, and I'll go over that in just a minute. Some people use like mason jars. Some people use like tall, thin glass jars. I prefer something with taller sides versus shorter sides. I've seen them with shorter sides, but it makes it a little more difficult to harvest. You're also going to need potatoes or oats. I have cultures with both. The one that I got was oats, but I kind of transitioned it over to potatoes. Started a couple pure potatoes, some that are oats and potatoes, some that are mixed. A lot of people say that the potatoes don't smell as bad as the oats. I didn't really find that to be the case. I found it to smell about the same personally. It does smell a little bit, not horrible. I keep them in my bedroom and I don't notice it. No one else in my family notices it either, so whether we've got nose blind to it or what, I'm not sure, but it's not that big of a smell. It's not like a constant rotting smell or anything like that. It's mainly when you just open up the container and get close to it. The other thing is I've noticed with my oats, I tend to get significantly more production out of them, so it's a lot more efficient. That being said, I get a lot out of my potato cultures as well, and in reality, one potato culture could feed my 10-gallon guppy tank multiple times a day. So depending on how much you're breeding or what you're breeding, you may want the oats, you may want just the potatoes. I also like the potatoes because I use the potatoes. You don't want any additives or anything in it, but they're the potatoes that I normally eat in my house already. So they're always in my house. I keep a stock of them versus I don't really eat much oatmeal or oats at all. So I don't really go out and buy that. I would have to go out and buy it specifically for the fish, which is fine, but the potatoes are just a little bit easier for me. So for me, I'm probably just going to keep going with the potatoes. Now, yeast is optional. Some people will tell you it's not, but I started one culture without yeast and it's doing just fine. Larry and Mary gave me a bag of yeast, so I've been using that. I also keep yeast because we bake in my house, so I've always got yeast on hand. I notice that it kind of starts a little quicker. Their culture starts, in 3 or 4 days versus like 6 to 7 days, but it's not like a make or break. If you don't have yeast, I wouldn't necessarily go buy it, but yeast also isn't that expensive, so it's one of those it's kind of up to you, but not a bad thing. But if you want yeast isn't a bad thing to have, it's just not required. You're also going to need to vent the container. It needs oxygen exchange, gas exchange, etc. Now there's a couple of different ways to do it. Most people just poke a hole in the top and shove polyfill or a cotton ball or something like that in it. Larry actually did a screen over it. At first he tried window screen, like you would see in a window, but he found that was still too big and allowed ants and flies and other things to get into them. So he went and put almost like a cheesecloth type of deal over it. Now I used a filter bag from Petco or PetSmart. They're PetSmart because it's top fin. They're like 75 cents at PetSmart, and it's the really fine mesh bags or whatever that you can kind of hold media in. I just cut like a 1 inch by 1 inch square and then hot glued around the edges. And I actually used a drill to drill a hole because it was cleaner, just because my scissors kept cracking the lids whenever I tried to poke a hole in it. So I just took a drill and drilled it. The hole doesn't need to be like a specific size, but you know, something like a pencil thick or something like that is about what I used. And then I just hot glued the 1 inch by 1 inch square of filter cloth over it, and I actually really like those. I also have the polyfill too. It's just kind of whatever's on hand. They're both cheap items. So now that you've got all your supplies, you're going to want to go ahead and prep the container. Like I said, you want a hole in the top for ventilation. If you don't, your culture is going to die and it's going to just kind of starve itself out of oxygen. So that's very important to have. Next, you're going to want to add your potatoes or your oats. Now, you want it a little bit runnier than you would probably like it, but you still want it thick enough so that when you turn it on the side, it's not going to fall out of the container. You don't want it like super, super wet, runny type of deal, but you don't want it like flaky thick either. So, you know, kind of like potatoes, but you added a little bit of like, or actually a lot of bit of butter, so they're not quite like wet, but you just want to use, like I said, the potatoes or oats, and then I use water from my tank. Some people use tap water, some people use dechlorinated water. I haven't tried anything. I've only used water from my tank just because it doesn't take that much water and it's usually right next to where I'm making it. You're going to want a layer to coat the bottom. I usually do like a 1/2 inch or so on my cultures. You don't want it too thin, but that's again, you don't want it like super thick either. You don't need it to be super thick. But there's no magic formula on how much you need. Just kind of coat the bottom and kind of go with what your gut says. Next, you're going to go ahead and add your culture. You don't need to add a ton of it. I usually try to cover half of the surface, and then I spread it all over the rest of the surface and go. You can start like 20 different things out of one little culture and just do a little bit in each one, or you can do like half of the culture into a new one and let it spread out, depending on how many you need or how much you want. Some people mix it, some people don't. I tried one with mixing and one without mixing, found it seeded about the same time, did about the same. I like to just kind of mix it up a little bit just because it looks better at the start, and then I don't have like clumpy like mounds later on. But again, just as long as it kind of gets on the food, the worms will find their way to the food. Now, I found most of my cultures took about 7 days before they were ready to harvest, but I had one that only took like 3 or 4 days, and then one that took like a week and a half, and it just, I don't know if it like depends on some of the variables I was playing with, but there was no constant on, you know, what the timing was, so it might just be, you know, one had a little bit of extra, one didn't, or whatever, I'm not quite sure. As far as storing them, I just keep them next to my fish tanks. I just have one for every tank that I breed stuff in. As far as maintaining the culture, these cultures should last about 8 weeks. I like to refresh my cultures. It's something that Wild Fish Tanks, Ryan over there, talked about in his video about them, adding some new food and kind of mixing it in. So I'll take half of the culture, start a new culture, and then take half of the fresh potatoes and mix it into the old one and kind of mix it. So it's almost like starting 2 new cultures, but you know, it's kind of refreshing the old one, if that makes sense, without having to clean out the container and start over. I do that every 4 to 6 weeks just so that I don't crash it early, and I like to have more than one running at a time just in case I do crash one. I don't have to like search for something. That's the other cool thing about these is, like I said, it really doesn't take a lot to start, and you know, starting a whole new culture doesn't really like deteriorate from it. So it's cool to kind of be able to give some to your friends, give some to other hobbyists in the area, so that if you ever do crash yours, you can kind of like make a couple phone calls and be like, hey, I need a, you know, just a scoop of your microworms or whatever. That's one of the reasons why Larry and Mary gave it to me is Mary was like, just in case we crash ours, I know that I can call you and get some microworm culture. So that's just kind of a good backup plan, and that way you're always going to have live food. And again, you're not going to have to buy it. And even if you don't, again, they're cheap. It's $5, $10, $15 online, and then you've got microworms. As far as feeding the microworms, I just use my finger. I just kind of ring along the sides, which is why you want a smooth container that's clear, and then just dip my finger in the tank. Some people use like a chopstick because they don't like touching it. I think I heard like the back of a plastic fork. I've heard of people using Q-tips, but I don't like that because it gets all wet. There's a couple of different options, but anything that you can kind of scrape along the side and then dip into the tank works out pretty good. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to harvest from these regularly. If you're not harvesting from them every like 2 or 3 days, you should. And if you're not, and you don't want to feed them that much to your tanks, like I have a couple of extra that I was playing with, and I got to the point where I literally had so many microworms and I didn't want to like super overfeed my tanks that I was harvesting and then running it down the tap, just rinsing my fingers off, because you can crash it if you let it kind of sit for too long without actually harvesting it. You'll run out of food and all the extra poop and all that stuff. So that is something to keep in mind. They should be good for, I have one that I sat for like a week and didn't harvest it, and there was a lot of worms in there, but it didn't crash or anything. But I do try to at least harvest it or at least clean it out fairly regularly so that I don't crash anything. So I've really enjoyed having these live foods to feed to my guppies. They seem to really enjoy it. The white cloud minnows really like it. Even the platies really like it behind me. And so it's a good food to have. I'm glad I'm starting to venture into the live foods, and I want to venture into some more live foods here pretty quickly. But I just got to figure out what my next project's going to be. So let me know if you feed any live foods in your fish room. If so, what live foods do you feed? And do you feed microworms? Have you tried microworms? What was your stories or success rate with them? I'm kind of curious on everyone else's. That seems to be one of the very popular live foods that people have, besides things like Daphnia and green water and stuff like that. And if you're new here, be sure to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification so you get notified every time I upload a video. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, you know what to do. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.